Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. My name is John Andrus. I am the Bill T. Jones Director and Curator of Performing Arts here at the ICA, and I'm so thrilled to welcome you to tonight's Art is Voice conversation with Raúl De Nieves and Jeffrey De Blois. Thank you for coming. If you haven't had a chance to see the exhibition yet, there should be time after tonight's program. If you head upstairs following the event to the 4th floor, the galleries are open until 9 p.m. So I hope you'll either see the show for the first time or check it out again. Raúl De Nieves is a New York-based interdisciplinary artist, performer, and musician whose multifaceted practice ranges from stained glass narrative paintings to animated performances to densely adorned figure sculptures encrusted with bangles, beads, bells, sequins, and other homespun materials. All of his works share a distinctive visual language that draws from Mexican craft traditions, religious iconography, mythology, and folktales to explore the transformational possibilities of adornment and the mutability of sexuality and identity. His work has been featured in numerous group exhibitions, as well as solo presentations around the world, including New York, Hong Kong, Athens, and Los Angeles. His work is included in the collections of the Whitney Museum of American Art and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, as well as the ICA. For his current exhibition, De Nieves created a body of interconnected works rooted in memory and exploring themes of personal transformation. The Treasure House of Memory expands De Nieves' inventive adaptation of iconographic traditions inherited from the past through vibrant combinations of form and material rendered in an energetic and joyous visual language. The other day I heard a 6-year-old turn to his mom and say, see, this is why I want a pony. If you go upstairs, you'll see why. So please join me in welcoming Raúl De Nieves and Jeffrey De Blois. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. This, for us, I think, feels like a little bit of a culminating experience. We've been working pretty intensely together for the last couple of years. And so Raúl and I would like to just start today's talk with a really brief moment of silence for us to sort of be together in the room, to collect our thoughts before we get into the conversation that will unfold. So thanks in advance. Thank you. You good?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that we should kind of start at the start. And so what our plan for today's talk is to talk about the development of Raúl's life and work kind of alongside one another. And then to sort of end by talking about his ICA exhibition, The Treasure House of Memory. And then at the end of the conversation today, we'll have time for question and answers. So there will be a couple of people kind of roaming around with mics. So put your hand up and someone will bring you a mic so that we can hear what you're saying. So I wanted to, like I said, start at the start and ask you about growing up in Mexico, where you lived until you were 9 years old, because I think, there's so many formative experiences that you had there that we've talked about that I think are directly related to your life and work now. And so I wanted to think about two things. I wanted to think first about this devotional object, Christ of the Miracles, in your hometown, an object that people made pilgrimages to, or make pilgrimages to rather, to be in front of it, and that holds a very special power. And then something else to sort of consider, I think, as part of this question is this dance of the old men, this sort of Mexican street tradition of these people adorning masks and dressing up as old men and performing in city centers and parks around your hometown. So I wanted to just start by asking you through the lens of these sort of ritual performances, but also ritual objects, about how your childhood in Mexico influenced the work that you're making today.
Well, definitely, I think for me, growing up with this very charged way of understanding how to deal with maybe an experience that happened to you, and that you could go to an object, it would create some sort of realization of maybe having a conversation with something that didn't need to respond to you, but that it created a recognition of wanting to feel that something is real. You know, like the Christ itself, it really did create so much respect to this object that people really felt so impelled to want to feel confined to. And, you know, when I think about like seeing that, not in a religious aspect, but in wanting to feel like you belong into something, it makes you realize what are the things that you hold in front of you that create that experience. And sometimes it's a wedding ring or your favorite shoes or something that you hold so close to you. I now have this special object in my life. I named her Hannah, and she's a doll. And she's been in my life for probably 17 years now. And my connection to this object has made me feel that from any time of like understanding other people relating to something and having a congregation to wanting to feel connected to, it gives you that opportunity. And even my object, like through my friendship circles, like people check up on the object and they have a connection somehow because it's so odd, but it's so real, because the energy is so charged. And just going to the Isabella Gardner Museum recently, like you realize how through the respect of things that have been, I don't know, like a desire of wanting to feel like you were a part of it, create this responsibility of you to take care of them. So obviously our exhibition really derived from this idea of the treasured house of memory, the memory, the commemoration, the memento mori, the thing that you feel the most charged to, whether it is something visual or something that you hold on to. But to me, I feel like I've really developed like what my practice is about through objects and really creating a really special relationship with something that gives me something back. My practice gives me not only an opportunity to talk to you, but an opportunity to put my relationship and my ideas into an object that maybe isn't existing until it becomes real.
No, that's a really beautiful thought. And to sort of follow on thinking about street performance, I wanted to ask you about, before we transition to talking, you know, about sculpture and your practice as an object maker in greater depth, about how central performance is in your work. You've played with your band Hairbone for more than 10 years now, I think, and you've done a lot of collaborative performances as well, like this one with Colin Self called The Fool, that was in several venues in New York. So I wanted to ask you about how music and performance is a kind of experimental way for opening up your practice that allows you to sort of defy genre, experiment, try different things, and sort of create a map for your work in other fields.
Well, I think obviously the beginning of thinking about a performance or trying to collaborate with someone is that it's not about you. It's about the collective mind, you know, and you're really opening up yourself to people that maybe feel the same way that you do or that have the same thought process. And music is obviously one of the most inviting ways to bring people into life. You know, it creates dance, it creates celebration, and it creates an experience. So growing up in San Diego, the first thing that I could really feel that I was a part of something was following the instincts of the punk underground scene, and feeling that not only through their perspective of creating a space, they invited you to be a part of something, and you wanted to be a part of this scene. You wanted to wear the same clothes that they wore, to feel that you had a connection. So for me, I think that was one of the first ways of realizing how I could actually have a voice. And when we think back of looking at the picture of the old man in Mexico dancing on the square that my family would take me to, and I would see this constantly and be like, why are these children playing this role of an elderly when they should be playing the role of like a child? It was like maybe the appreciation, but also the culture that gives you back something of an understanding. So for me, obviously, like building these like kind of, I don't know, circles around yourself that really feel like that they're open, like, and that you can actually invite yourself and open to a perspective of like wanting to know what is in somebody else's mind and how you react to it. Like Hairbone, like my band really became this just moment of moving to New York and seeing someone like performing and having a relationship with them. And like, I don't know, I think it's just as simple as that, as asking to be in someone's like perspective of like wanting to create and feel that not just through you, but through them, you can make something bigger than, a 10-year long distance relationship that actually never has anything else to give other than the respect.
Mm-hmm. And as much as we think about sort of expressing ourselves, we can also sort of subvert ourselves to create a mutual expression when we play in a band with someone else, to create this kind of combination of perspectives that leads to something new, that leads to then a new perspective for yourself as well. And I think that you've mentioned sort of getting dressed already, and so I think an interesting transitional object to think about talking about your sculpture is to talk about your work with shoes. Oops, I don't know if this is working. Maybe while we wait for that to catch up, I'll just ask you about shoes, because it was really shoes and sort of exploring the way that they are sculptural to begin with, that they are potentially architectural as well, the way that they support the body, the relationship they have with the body. It's really through your experiments with working with shoes and beating them that you came to your sort of more, there we go. So here's an early pair of shoes to think about how you kind of adorned them to create this expression of yourself when going out, this kind of performance in public. So maybe can you just talk a little bit about how you see shoes as kind of like embedded with memory, having the special relationship to yourself, and how you came to kind of accumulate objects on top of them as you eventually move towards that get us closer to thinking about the sculptural forms that you're really working with today.
Well, I think the beginning, like if you go back to the picture of the earlier shoes, these were a pair of shoes that I wore through so much of my life in San Francisco for years. And I remember like being like, I'm moving to New York, and I had to throw away so many things. And I threw away this pair of shoes, and the next day I went back to the trash can that I had thrown these away, and they were still there. And I took them with me, and I felt a connection because they reminded me of so many different experiences I had with my friends, and I think just myself, but also this kind of relationship that I once the shoe didn't work anymore, like adding the tape or something became so much more about me trying to take care of an object that felt like it was a part of me. And when I discarded it, it almost felt a little bit selfish. But I think going back to actually picking it up and moving to New York City and having this shoe in front of me, whatever, creating some sort of trajectory of me, like giving me like an opportunity to believe that there was something else. It actually just opened up my mind to think about like how we use objects and how we embed memories into things, and why it was so important for me to not let go of this thing, to think that this thing had some sort of really prominent meaning to me, which now, 15 years later, this shoe has helped me create works that really developed from the idea of care. And in a way, I think the idea of the shoe having two different, the left and the right, and that they needed to be a partner, it was, once again, this kind of idea of care, and a desire for wanting to have that, to believe that, I don't know, my practice is very intuitive, but I think it was very intuitive in that way to kind of go to the trash and pick it up and then think of it like as a trophy of something that would help me develop like my artistic practice, almost like a teacher, like it gave me the prodigy to be in control of something that I had.
And were your shoes the first of your objects that you were invited to show in an exhibition?
Yeah, and actually, to be honest, like I had no consideration for them, so they actually were sitting at the side of whatever, and this curator was like, "I love the shoes. Can we put them in the show?" And he made a reference to like Andy Warhol and like other artists that have used footwear. And I felt connected, and it kind of also sparked like some sort of realization to me. So I was also very like kind of thankful that somebody else took them like not just for granted, but that they saw them as like something that really had value in them, and that they could bring like an understanding to the exhibition or whatever. So it actually was a push from somebody else reminding me that not just me taking them out of the trash, but they had no realization that happened, that somebody else kind of had like some sort of reaction to this object. And, it was probably because they were very charged with emotions.
Yeah, and it's amazing that someone else can sort of bring you back to yourself and seeing the value of your work in that way. And so it's really sort of, the accumulation of beading that you do on shoes becomes, increasingly more elaborate, more Baroque, taking on different shapes and scales over time as you're working on it. And it really leads to the sort of life-size figurative sculpture covered in beads that you have sort of become associated with. And so, this work, Days of Wonder, I know you worked on for 7 years. It was in many ways, a kind of breakthrough object that allowed you to kind of make this transition to working with larger sculptural objects. This is the first work of yours that I saw in 2015 at Greater New York at MoMA PS1. So I wanted to just, maybe hear from you about how you viewed this transition to thinking about figurative sculptures, thinking about a life-size object, and how, maybe that even becomes more charged because we have a relationship to life-size figurative sculptures with our own bodies that we bring our own selves to. So to hear from you a little bit about what that process was like.
Well, Days of Wonder is derived from Days of Wonder, which is my mother's daycare, and my mother is a caretaker of other people's children, and she tells me that she takes care of children from 6 months to 4 years. So that's a long time, that's a long time to develop a relationship, not just with the child, but with the family. And she has probably like 12 to 14 kids. And since I grew up like knowing my mom, she's always been kind of this caretaker. So I wanted to really think about maybe what I was doing as a way to take care of like my practice and really put the emphasis on the idea of like defeating something. When I was making this work, it just didn't work. It took a lot of integrity to put up with it. I saw it fall apart. My friends would come over to my studio and they'd be like, "Where's the baby now?" And it's in a box or whatever. And it came to this point of despair of like taking the piece apart and finding out what was wrong with it. But at that moment, I had wanted to desire this relationship with something that I was close to. And I think when I think about what I do as an artist, it's my own personal reflection. So my art practice gives me a time for me to develop a relationship with myself, not just in the making process, but in a care practice that gives me the opportunity to see beyond myself, having this relationship with this object that had a relationship with an idea of my mother was something that I wanted to connect, because I also wanted to connect to an understanding of what my mother was doing, what she does and why she keeps having this relationship with like outside families, but how she builds a beautiful like experience to herself. And this object really gave it to me, like, I don't know, it's really hard to explain all of this because it is very personal, but there were so much moments of just like wanting to not continue, but the only thing I had to do was to try to make this object be realized for no reason. And obviously, yeah, you saw the piece in a museum, but the piece wasn't like made for an exhibition or anything. I think it was just an experience for myself. And I think that's when I realized that I'm taking on a responsibility within myself to create something that really has a meaningful aspect, not just to me and hopefully to others, but can develop maybe a personal relationship. So that's what this work really entitles itself, and where it really began, like, I think, my trajectory of being an artist, to really take the time to reflect upon something that didn't work, but needed to have an end resolution to it all.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's really lovely. Thank you for that. That's an incredibly generous response for sure. And you can see that leads to sort of other expressions that you come to in other figurative sculptures as well, that I think then has a kind of like, almost fever pitch when you're invited to do the 2017 Whitney Biennial. And you really, I think, sort of turn to storytelling in a different way. The individual objects, of course, have their own stories, but here, for me, the way that you're kind of, simulating stained glass, creating an environment for seeing the individual sculptures together and thinking about the way that you're deploying language and, you know, symbolism sort of differently in the stained glass, and looking to some pre-modern traditions as well. I wanted to ask you about this moment as a way to think about this kind of turn to storytelling, which we'll talk about a little bit more, but I think relates to the exhibition here, as well as thinking about a body of works together that tell a story, even if it's not one that's didactic, that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, but that nevertheless turns on ideas of storytelling. So could you maybe talk a little bit about how that came back into your work, maybe through this Whitney piece?
Well, obviously the Whitney piece was pretty much a commission that I was like asked to do. Like I didn't think I could do this kind of work, but the opportunity was handed to me, and the first thing that I thought about was like being afraid, you know, to show myself to the people that already had this trajectory of understanding what art should be, and it's the Whitney Biennial. And not only am I not asked to do a work, but like put work in front of a building that already has so much respect. And, you know, making this work really developed a relationship with myself about what it means to be afraid of your own personal self. And so when you look at this, the first layer, or the first bottom floor of this piece, is what I call someone like in bed, sick, and they're asking for help. And there's these personal demons and these flies flying around them. But then you're kind of like rewarded to this idea of like dancing carefully through life, through these urns. And then there's these gates that break down and have these words of peace, love, like justice, hope. But it all really just turned itself to kind of wanting to feel that kind of challenge, and to think of creating a piece of artwork that had multiple feelings, not only of using this kind of traditional way of making work as in a stained glass. This isn't stained glass, it's like paper and tape. So it's like a fake facade of something, but it creates, to me, like it defeats the way of how you make work. You know, you're trying to believe that this is something that you can do, but this work really showed me that not only could I command space, but that I was able to work around my own personal fears of wanting to understand that I could do this thing without having any help, you know, other than myself. But the help was already there. And that was the thing. It was like turning the points of realizing that the curators of the museum were allowing me to experiment with my practice and not feel that I needed to be so rigorous about what I needed to do, but for them to believe that, you know, something was going to come about. You know, when they asked me, like, please, can you make a sketch of this piece so that we can have an idea of how it works, I literally had to be like, well, I can't do that because you're just asking me to do this in a short amount of time. So now you have to believe in me. And they did, you know, and it was a very celebratory fact of like a realization, I think, for everyone around. And that was kind of what this piece really allowed me to kind of feel like, with conversations with Jeffrey, like making our show and being like, we should talk about, and it's like, well, let's just talk about like what we're doing, and and how we develop like ideas and create an exhibition of work that really comes to be meaningful.
And before we turn to talking about the Treasure House of Memory, I wanted to ask you about this work, this carousel, where again, I think you're sort of taking so many of the learnings that you had from doing that Whitney piece and sort of like challenging yourself, seeing what's going to be possible for you, and really kind of like up the ante in a particular way, because this is just like such an incredible piece. It's so sort of Baroque and over the top, and you know, it starts to think about ideas of the cycle of life, you know, the circular shape of the carousel and the sort of going around and coming back, which I think speaks directly to themes from the Treasure House of Memory. So what was it like to then realize a piece like this, where you have known from the Whitney show that you can do something big, but then going even bigger?
Well, the beginning of this conversation really needs to be about like the integrity of the artist, and making a work like this is surreal. Like, it doesn't happen every day. Like, you know, you can have museum shows and so much help from whoever, but this piece was commissioned by a commercial brand, Bulgari, which they are, you know, they design diamonds for Elizabeth Taylor. Like, they've been a house of luxury for so many years. And when they asked me to submit a proposal for the show, I spoke to many people about doing this project, and people were worried about it because it came from a commercial brand. But they were literally telling me, you can do whatever you want and realize your project. And it was actually really scary, to be honest, you know, because once I decided that I wrote a proposal of making a carousel, I was like, what did I just put myself into? Like, not necessarily, I don't want to make a carousel. It's just, I'm like, how do I do this? And there was so much support. And this is something that we have to remind ourselves outside of our context of wherever you are, you will be put in a category of what you need to do and like follow your instincts. But the art world really was deciding that doing things in a commercial aspect would break your career, you know, like put you in a situation where maybe you would be looked at as a fool. You know what? The fool looks up on his fucking, like, I'm sorry for my language, on its edge, and he doesn't fall. He has a decision. And this carousel would never have existed without the help of actually people that wanted to be a part of not just your trajectory, but the trajectory of the art world. Now the carousel travels as a carousel, not just as a piece of artwork, but a work that develops what a carousel does. It's a piece of this memory. You know, when I chose to work with the idea of the carousel and the cycles of life, I wanted to think about like what it was to feel the anxiety of wanting to push myself, you know, and think about creating something with a mechanism. And I felt the carousel really just showed me an idea of growth. Because when I was thinking about the carousel, I was like, well, what does it feel like to look at a carousel when you're 23 years old as opposed to when you were 3 years old? And when you take a 3-year-old to look at a carousel, and then you have to take you know, you have to remind yourself to be that person, to have that relationship. And I don't know, I feel like this artwork really just gave me a real understanding of the world outside of like my comfort zone. and the world outside of other people's comfort zone, and how it creates relationships. And I think that's something that nowadays, we're like 2022, and work is really connected with not just like these small houses of like art schools and museums and things. It's like people are collaborating and opening up all these trajectories with so many different people to create experiences for other people to be a part of, and this really gave me, I think, the biggest kind of turnaround to grow, not just an artist, but to really become a professional in a field that gave me an opportunity to work with a huge like house, a huge, trajectory of people to think that I could manage a project that was so childish based around a carousel, something so trajectory as like that. So this work, really reflects, I think, upon the growing aspects and the growing pains, not just of who I am as a person, but maybe the people around me. And it reminds me of something that I looked at as a child as something of mystery, but I think I've learned what that mystery really reflects, which is a responsibility. And it actually feels really beautiful because as I'm looking up to you, like these lights are a little bit harsh on my eyes, but I think about this piece as when I look into the sun, I see you, like looking at something that you kind of don't want to maybe reflect upon, but to feel that you're a part of is something really special.
And I mean, it's such a joyful object to me too. And I think that like the more you know your work, you see this, and it makes so much sense on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's totally irrelevant, like where the impetus to make it came from. Like, will history remember Bulgari or like the joyfulness of the object? It's, not for us to say necessarily, but I think when you look at your work, it makes perfect sense that you did this and realized this really beautiful, joyful object. And now just to turn to talking about the exhibition upstairs, the Treasure House of Memory, it's worth just mentioning that the show was originally intended to open in July of 2020. But because of the pandemic, obviously, it didn't open until September of 2021. So Raul and I had way more time than we ever thought we were going to have to make this exhibition. And as he's sort of alluded to already, we kind of made the decision with one another that we were going to make the show in a really particular way, that it was going to be really rooted in having a kind of sense of mutual trust, a kind of openness with one another, a willingness to influence one another, and to sort of like ask ourselves the question, what happens in this process of working together, of making an exhibition together? What happens when you let love in the room, when you let love into the process? And so, there were some very dark times for so many of us in March and April of 2020 as so much was uncertain, but we committed to one another insofar as we spoke every week. We checked in with one another, even when Raul wasn't necessarily making work, couldn't get to his studio. And so we decided to sort of embark on the adventure of making an exhibition together in a new way at that moment with this kind of new perspective and new perspectives that were opening up to us. So here you see us talking. I don't even remember when this was, but there was pretty much a Skype every week. For months, it seemed like. We shared images, inspirational images back and forth. So Raul mentioned that the Vatican's Gallery of Maps was really influencing how he was thinking about a large-scale work that you see upstairs that is very much a kind of memory map. And I was really influenced by Pier Paolo Pasolini at that time, trying to think about what other artists do I look to when I think about Raul's work, when I think about how he engages with tradition in a really particular way? And rather than it being like another visual artist, for me, it was Pasolini. And so maybe we can come back to that a bit later. But we also sort of endeavored to read books together. So we read these two in particular that I think really ended up influencing the exhibition that you see upstairs. So there's Francis Yates' book, The Art of Memory, and Simon Critchley's book, Memory Theater. The Treasure House of Memory actually comes from Francis Yates' book. It's a phrase that's commonly used by several different writers. Rainer Maria Rilke also used it in his Letters to a Young Poet, which was something that we read together. But I just mentioned this because I kind of know for myself what, the way that we worked together meant for me and meant for the realization of the exhibition that you see upstairs. But I wanted to ask you, what was the process like from your perspective, and how do you think it worked its way into the exhibition, if it did at all?
I mean, I might get a little emotional, but to me, I think when I first started working on this piece, it developed with the horse, and I was in a moment of despair where, COVID had happened, and we couldn't have relationships, and so I guess the only thing I had was my personal practice, to go to my studio and to believe that there was something that could fulfill whatever I was missing outside of the studio world. But then I started to realize that I had been making so much work based around these experiences that weren't there anymore. So if you look at this work, there's the three mares that fall on the grounds, and they all reflect three different, very charged moments of my life that I personally only experience. And I was trying to make joy out of those things because they did come with a lot of sadness. But the sadness only became a form of joy because I was working through them, really developing who I am as a person through this manual practice, this repetitive form of creating moments, the beating is an everyday thing, that every day it's a different feeling. And I've had friends help me with these works, and they engulf themselves and remembering when they had a moment to do that. But it was really beautiful to think about this experience with Jeff and to talk about our exhibition, but also to talk about our feelings, to really become friends and become not just, colleagues, to really feel that we had a moment to open up to ourselves and share different aspects of things that inspired us to create something that's sitting upstairs. And I've realized so much through that work, it's also made me realize that I'm done making work about the past. Now it's about making work about the future, about how I feel, and to really think that everything that I've ever been able to experience personally has been something that's made me grow as a person. So this exhibition is one of the most beautiful experiences because it not only has given me a self-realization of conversating, but thinking about really personal, charged things that I wanted to work through and put that feeling onto these objects that, really do have that meaning. So the Treasure House of Memories will always be something that creates a moment of a time capsule, and it's not about looking back, it's about looking forward. So I'm really thankful for that.
Me too. I want to make sure that we have time for folks to have to ask questions if they have them. So I wanted to just return to Pasolini really quick with one last question, and I wanted to read this quote to you that I know we have talked about before, and it's something that he said in an interview that really made me think immediately of your work. And he said, "I experience things in a very interior fashion. My view of things of the world, objects, is not a natural or secular one. I always see things as being a bit miraculous. For me, every object is a miracle. My view of the world is in a certain way a religious one, though not rigid and sectarian. That's why I invest this way of seeing things in my work." So I wanted you to maybe sort of respond to that idea that every object is a miracle, and if you could sort of through the prism of the objects that are in the exhibition upstairs.
Well, I feel like in the works there's so many secrets, but there's one secret that most people could look into, but because of museums, you're not allowed to open. So, if you want to be a rebel and break into the box, you can open Pandora's box. So, I don't know. I mean, I think going back to even thinking about where the word derived from the shoe and how the shoe disappears, and this object really is charged with emotions and life. It's through experiences, and I don't know, I seriously, I love Boston. This is not my first, second, or third time here, but we went with my friend Ambera, who has a painting in the painting show. We went to the Isabella Gardner Museum, and it's been just to think about how people care about things of history and how you can preserve memories and these kind of really important things that can be kind of creepy, but also, I don't know, I want to feel more emotion through work. I want to feel more emotion through people's understanding of relationships with objects. And I feel like we should all go hug a tree and create a relationship with an object that's not speaking to us, and it probably would save the world somehow.
Well, we have some time for questions, so if you have one, please do raise your hand and someone will bring a microphone to you. Yeah, Danny down here in front, I think.
Not her! Not her!
Excuse me. Hi, I'm a big fan. Days of Wonder is such a beautiful work, and I wanted to know, because a lot of your work has this quality where it feels like it could go on forever. And Days of Wonder seems anchored specifically in a time period of life. And I wondered how you think about finishing works, if it's in terms of form or time, and how you think about that in terms of ending the cycle of the work or completing it.
Well, I think definitely Days of Wonder gave me that perspective to think that, when we think about going to school or something, it's like a 4-year practice. But when you break those boundaries, how it just opens up a whole new world to care or whatever. But, I don't know, it's really hard to think about things coming to an end, but I always realize that an end is a new beginning. So with work, and especially the beads, it's the more accumulation I can have, I feel like the more really it gives from me, because what personally I want and what I think my work has given me is the work really is the perfect mirror of myself. You know, like I see myself through this practice, and it really creates these moments that I think we all want. We want that 5-year relationship. We want to feel like you have something that gives you that kind of mark, and it's really hard to find. So I think Days of Wonder really is one of the only works that I ever felt that relationship. But I think it was also because I was trying to mirror it, not just with myself, but with my mother, you know, something that was really kind of important to me. And I don't know, thinking about like making things, it's like you want to have the fruits of the world and be like, I want to do this and this and this. And it's really hard to focus. So I think that's the thing, it's trying to find a focus and a belief system. So hopefully that answered your question. Diva.
Any other questions out there?
Hi, I was just wondering if there are pieces that are too personal for you to share, and if you, like you just mentioned, your works are kind of mirrors of yourself, if there are aspects that you don't want the world to see, and how you choose what to let people see.
Well, I think this is like when I become really like TMI, and I'm like, and even having these conversations, I'm like, let me just read through my diary with you and let you know how I really feel. I don't have anything that I think I would be the worst person to keep a secret, you know, like, but I really think that it's important to just let people know how you feel, or it's the only way that I've known to deal with myself. So no, you know, I think even thinking about the work upstairs, it's like the Mayor of 33s was a relationship I had to deal with because that's when my father died. And I didn't get to realize that until I turned 33, and how surpassing my father's age felt, not just through myself, but like my brothers. And we would talk about it, you know, like after my brothers and I are all 2 years apart, and we're like, we all surpassed Dad's life. And it would be like, whoa, you know, like really crazy, like crying. But then we'd be like, well, how do you feel, Mom? And she'd be like, I don't want to talk about it. And then we'd be like, tell us. And it would be a lot of information. And we'd be like, oh my God, we're so selfish for wanting to feel that surpassion, but you have a different relationship to what it was like. So I think it's just, you know, you choose to make your work a part of your life because you want to talk about it.
And yours is also like, I mean, at least in this exhibition, I think, like, even though there are secrets, right, that you've like sort of hidden in objects or around, but it's also like a kind of exhibition about letting go in a particular way. And I just remember you, like when we were installing it, like having these stones that you had carried around with you for years and then just like affixing them to sculptures. And so it also became, you know, a process of healing in which you're sort of like letting go of the past, like as you said, to let this be a kind of like from this moment forward that you start dealing with the future in your work in a different way.
Definitely. I mean, I think that's the hardest question to be asked to. It's like, and I think this is something that I ask upon myself, but other people have asked upon me. It's like, you gotta let go. And then you're like, let go of what? I think I've let go of enough. But then you're like, oh my gosh, I really have to like dig really deep in order to understand what the next thing to let go of. And nobody can tell me what it is, because it's like like asking for a question without an answer, and the answer will only show itself through time, you know, and it's the only time that, I mean, I think that's something that we have to ask ourselves a lot. Like, how do we grow as people is through letting go, and whatever that is, like personal, it's so mental, you know, it's not about something that's like sitting next to you. It's something that's way deeper that you can't access, and it doesn't come immediate. It takes time, and the more you ask yourself, the harder or easier it is to access that kind of like answer.
I think that's a really good note to end on. So Raul, thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you so much for your great generosity and openness.
Thank you.
Thank you for your friendship and collaboration. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. I'll invite you to go check out the show in the galleries if you haven't seen it yet, or maybe you'll see it new this time. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Ooh.